knows the range of things that we do at the state treasury. So I want to explain a couple of those things and how they connect to this question of innovation. We are the investment shop for the state. We invest in the state's portfolio, which is about $100 billion. The vast majority of that is in retirement funds, and that means that our obligation is to generate returns for beneficiaries. And that means we have to be very, very cognizant of innovation, both on the upside, looking for opportunities, and making sure that we're managing risks. Climate disruption is a prime example of that. We convened a national and international group about a year ago to take on that question. How do we mitigate for climate disruption as an investment risk? And similarly, how do we embrace the opportunities that provides? We hired the first investment officer whose exclusive focus is on environmental, social, and governance risks. I'm very proud of that team, and you should feel good about it too, because that approach and those talented people mean that if you look at the 1, 3, 5, and 10-year results for our peers in investment returns, Oregon is either number 1 or number 2 in every one of those periods, and that's something we all have a stake in. We're also the group that looks out for Oregon's credit rating and issues the bonds that finance infrastructure. So we pay attention to innovation in those products and the approaches we use to work with local governments and partners around the state. And finally, we are innovating on financial empowerment, making sure that people have access to savings for retirement, for college, for the costs associated with disabilities. All of these things, I think, add up to an approach where we're trying to bring financial empowerment to people in Oregon. We're trying to boost the economy generally, and ultimately trying to reduce the need for government expenditures. And I think that adds up to innovation. And I also agree with the speaker. We're especially looking forward to your questions and ideas here shortly. So please be ready.
Treasurer Reed, I'd like to stay with you for a moment. When you were in the legislature, you played a key role around promoting innovation for the state, and was part of kind of setting up some of the systems that we have, and now as treasurer, you're doing the same. So my question for you is, what role does the state have in setting up systems to encourage investment in innovation? Particularly interested in some of the comments you have about your Oregon Saves program, but also your seat on the Oregon Innovation Council and the Oregon Growth Board.
A lot to cover here. This is stuff I really care about, that I really enjoyed working on in the legislature and that I enjoy working on now. There's a nice bit of continuity in both of the elements that you mentioned. Oregon Saves was one of the last things I worked on in the legislature, and now I get to work on it as treasurer. And this is something we should all be proud of in Oregon too. We're the first state in the country to take on this retirement savings crisis. You've probably all seen the study from the Fed that says about 40% of people in the country, if they were faced with an unexpected $400 expense, they couldn't cover it without selling something. That's a pretty shocking statistic when you think about how close all of us are at any given moment to an expense of that size that we can't anticipate. And it can throw people into a really terrible sequence financially. That's consistent with the fact that the majority of working age families in the country haven't saved anything for retirement. And that holds in Oregon too, where about 1 million people in Oregon, close to half of our workforce, don't have access to a way to save for retirement at work. So we were not satisfied with that, and the legislature pushed us forward to create the first in the country opt-out IRA. And it's doing great things. We're 2 years into this now. We have 100,000 people who have IRA accounts. Half of those are now funded, and the rest are in the pipeline. They've saved $26 million, a number that goes up close to $3 million every month. But apart from all of those numbers, what it really does is give people a sense of empowerment. So you can watch people light up. They start smiling, and they can get kind of a far-off look in their eye, and they say things like, I got a future now. I can see myself getting ahead. And I think that's a form of innovation that we should all get behind. And it means they're also going to require less assistance in an already stretched state budget over the long run. The other end of the spectrum, I feel like we have real opportunities in the Oregon Innovation Council and the Oregon Growth Board. you think about it as a relay race, this is very early on in helping to commercialize the cutting edge research and development that happens at our universities, amongst our entrepreneurs, whether it's someone selling shoes or building drones. Both of them involve cars, I noticed in that story. That's often the place where good ideas start. And we have a role in the state to provide the assistance that might not otherwise be there, to make sure that those conditions are present for people to do their best thinking and their best work. The speaker probably is, one reason she might be glad I'm not in the legislature anymore is it's a little harder for me to pressure her about the Oregon Innovation Council and the Oregon Growth Board, but I care about that a lot, and I'm glad that as treasurer I still have a seat on those two groups, because they play an important role in how the economy of the state is going to look in years to come. It's a hard argument to make to people in a campaign or on a doorstep that Oregon Growth Board, the Oregon Innovation Council, it's not going to change the size of your kids' class, but it might change the size of your grandkids' class, because the ideas that are generated there turn into companies, which turn into jobs, which turns into tax revenue, which turns into more teachers and better classrooms. So these things, I think, are easily forgotten in the culture that is very focused on the present, but for me, the biggest important thing is to keep thinking about the long run in the context of innovation.
Thank you, Treasurer. Speaker Kotek, as we know, there can be many competing interests in the legislative session. From your perspective, how is the state doing a good job of prioritizing innovation? And you already touched on some examples around housing and addressing climate change. Kind of what opportunities do you see with both of those moving forward?
Thank you, Chris. It's good to follow the treasurer on this, because when you think about innovation from a government perspective, state government, local government, change and innovation is probably most usually approached in an incremental way. Government, by the very nature of what we do, is a little bit risk averse. We have to provide essential services. We can't chase an innovative idea and not do what we're doing. There's the ability to move quickly is, not the hallmark of government, because we need to make sure basic things are happening. That being said, government should be a catalyst for innovation when it can, and we are trying at the state level. I believe when additional sources of revenue are identified or when new ideas are being hatched, it is incumbent upon state government, the state legislature, to make sure innovation is in the mix. If we talk about the new business tax that will be funding education to another $1 billion a year through the Student Success Act, in that bill, you will find innovation. How do we help schools meet the outcomes we're demanding of them with the additional revenue? New ideas coming out of the Department of Ed, and requiring new ideas and innovation at the school district level. So when new money is in the mix, it really is our job to make sure we are catalyzing change and innovation. Another way the state can help in a crisis situation is to make sure that innovation can occur and remove barriers to that change and transformation that we need when there's a particularly large challenge out there that we're trying to deal with. Housing affordability and supply is a particularly important topic to me and the entire state, no matter where you live. In the session, we worked hard to pass House Bill 2001, which says our current approach to what we build in residential communities has been too limited. We needed more options out there. So that bill, by its passage, will allow and require communities of a certain size to provide different types of housing, middle housing, not just your single family detached home, not just your large multi-apartment complex, but duplexes and triplexes and quads, those types of in-between types of homes that can be more affordable because you can build more on a lot. And frankly, we have people moving here. We want to value our land use system. We need to have newer opportunities, and that's what that bill provided. But we as a state shouldn't just make change like that and not provide support. We did provide technical assistance money that will help local communities make this change. So it's a have a goal, provide some resources. I think that type of balance is how we best do our work. Now, in terms of really cutting edge innovation as it relates to things that the treasurer was a real champion on when he was in the legislature, we really are competing. There's not a lot of money to go around. So usually we are most successful in the innovation realm if there are public-private partnerships, if there is a way to incentivize activity to take place, pilot projects. I know some people don't like pilots, but we need to be able to show that a new infusion of state tax dollars is going to have the impact we want. Not just for innovation's sake, but for a particular goal. And pilot projects often get us there. So if you're in a community where you're looking for some help because you have that idea as a local government or a business sector, trying to pilot that, coming in small, trying to get us to help be a catalyst for that change is a good role for the state. Once you go too big, it gets harder for us because without resources to go around, we have to be very cautious about how we do it. So again, I think that's very true for the conversation around climate disruption. Looking for that innovation, adaptation, transformation, and those partnerships was an underlying value of the carbon reduction bill that was moved through the House during the session. We can continue to work on that, but again, it is about partnership and looking at crisis. And crises like climate or housing do demand us as a state to be innovative, remove barriers, and invest wisely in a way that actually will bring prosperity for all parts of the state.
And I want to go slightly off script and give a lot of acquaintances and colleagues in those circles, and the reaction that they had to the passing of House Bill 2001 and the impact it's going to have on what cities look like into the future, the impact it'll have on addressing climate change is monumental. A lot of them are putting it up as a bill we'll look back 30 years from now, like we look back on some of our urban growth boundary bills, access to public beach bills. It really is monumental, and I'm not sure it got the credit it totally deserved in this last session due to other conversations, but kudos to that. A lot of folks are looking at it as groundbreaking nationally and in some cases globally, so thank you. Mark, you talked a lot about just kind of the role innovation plays. Can you speak to the notion that innovation is important to economic development in general, and maybe more specifically our long-term competitiveness as a state, and if you have any kind of data or trends you're seeing, how that plays out in coastal communities?
Sure. So first I'd like to second what both the speaker and the treasurer said. That for one, states right now are traditionally haven't really devoted a tremendous amount of resources to innovation or R&D, at least directly. But that said, there's a large and growing role for that in the future. And why is that role growing? At the state level, well, for one, the federal government has largely gotten out of the R&D business. And the federal R&D or government R&D is particularly useful because it's basic research. It's not necessarily starts with a profit motive in hand, and a lot of the best technological enhancing discoveries are made there. And so what's happened in the federal government is we've just seen this share devoted to R&D dwindle over time. First, back in the 60s and 70s, we were devoting up to 3% of our GDP to R&D. We had the space race, and after that we had the Cold War. But since then it's continued to decline, and more recently we've seen very large cuts to the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health and the like at the federal level. So now at the federal level we're looking at 0.7% of GDP, less than half of what it was even 30 years ago. So very limited role now from the federal government, and we're also seeing a pullback in the private sector in terms of innovation. And again, I mentioned before, where does this happen in the private sector? Well, a lot of it happens in new firms and startup firms and the like. And the share of startup firms in the economy has really been tumbling over time as well, where we have now only about 1 in 10 of our firms are startups, and about only 1 in 50 of our workers are employed in a startup, which again is about half of what it was 30 years ago, and continues to fall. And so this is a concern. Some folks would say, well, it's not necessarily a problem as long as large firms, the big ones, are doing as much of the research as the little ones used to, but there's not a lot of evidence for that. And another argument that a lot of venture capital folks make is say, well, it doesn't really matter that we don't have as many small firms, because the small startup firms now are better quality than they used to be, that we vet them better, and so that they're more likely to make discoveries. But that's not entirely obvious either. From a statistical point of view, right now, any given startup has about the same chance of hitting it big as they used to. So we think of them as all as ping pong balls, and some of them hit and some of them don't. Well, it's definitely a better world to have more of those ping pong balls out there, which we certainly don't at this time. And so this, with the lack of federal government investment in R&D and a pullback in the startups in the private sector level, it really does open the door for some of these state innovations, or either in direct investment in coastal communities, which you would need, above all else, is connectivity, both in terms of transportation infrastructure, broadband, and the like. Can we get as connected to the urban areas as possible so that innovators don't face a disadvantage in coastal and rural communities? But even without direct investment, the government can do things in terms of easing regulations and the like, which are often cited as what's going on with a lot of the lack of startups, insofar as some of them can't get over the regulatory hurdles as easily as a large firm, things like occupational licensing and the like.
I appreciate you referencing broadband. I think we got part of the way there on that issue in the last session, and I think we got some more work to do. And I will say, for communities on the coast, access to broadband is just as important as perhaps our transportation infrastructure. So look forward to continuing that conversation and those investment opportunities, particularly in rural Oregon. We have a limited amount of time left, and as you heard, folks up on the panel are very interested in questions. We're going to see if we can logistically do this. I think we have one or two folks with a microphone that down here that we can pass around. I think we're also open if you have a loud voice or even want to yell at us your question. We'll take it that way as well. So does anyone, I see, is that Representative Gomberg? Representative Gomberg has a question.
Ineligible?
Yeah, are you eligible for this? Or?
Thank you, Chris. A recent report by the Office of Economic Analysis called Changing of the Guard confirms that new tech jobs in Oregon have more than made up for losses of jobs in our natural resources industries. But it also confirms that 80% of those new jobs are based in the Tri-County area, and that, interestingly, most of them are being filled by white males. So how do we ensure that the investment in innovation reaches all the people of Oregon and all parts of Oregon, particularly this part of Oregon?
Absolutely. In terms of the forest products or broader industry, what Representative Gomberg says is absolutely true. So at the statewide level, if you go up to 30,000 feet, you see that in terms of numbers of jobs, we went from 30,000 forest product jobs in the 70s to 10,000 now, and the opposite happened in terms of tech investment, or tech jobs. And in terms of the forest product jobs, it's at this 30,000 foot level. What makes it even worse is the relative pay has eroded to the point where a job at a mill now pays no more than the average job at the statewide level. But that certainly is not true when we look more granularly, and in particular our rural communities, where the timber still takes up both a disproportionate share of the economy plus pays above average regional wages. And so it's very important, even in some of our older industries or resource industries, or those that are facing challenges with secular decline, to continue to innovate, because
Commissioner did a good job of mentioning that for this region. The other thing I think is making sure that those opportunities are known to the people who are working to support them. And I think particularly about the Oregon Growth Board, where part of our mission is to support a resident venture capital community and venture capital that has an interest in Oregon. When we know about technologies, ideas, companies, funds that have that, we'll be better able on the Growth Board to advance that. So all of you in this room and those outside have knowledge about what's going on in your communities, and I'd encourage you to keep in touch with us about what's happening so we can do a better job making those connections.
And again, I also think that's a great question. I am optimistic in the sense that the Student Success Act, I want to go back to that, $1 billion per year new investment in pre-K through 12. 15 years from now, we'll have the first generation of kids who have had increased access to early childhood education, more career and technical education in K-12, more supports to be successful. Getting back to Mark's comments about the 3 things that you need for economic development: workforce, making sure every community has that workforce. And then as a state, getting back to kind of what I think our role is removing barriers and making sure the basics are there. Let's talk about rural broadband again. I was sitting across the way listening to the conversation a little bit. If we don't have connectivity in every community, particularly on the coast or any place that is not as dense as the I-5 corridor, we have a problem. You can't bring in new technologically connected jobs or even support the current industries unless we have the broadband connections. And I'm in full support of the Rural Telecom Investment Act that we will bring back in the session next year to broaden the base and increase the universal service charge, which was created back in the 90s for landlines, making sure everyone had a landline. Well, I would be very happy as a North Portlander to spend a little bit more money on my wireless bill to make sure every community in the state has rural broadband, and that's what that bill will do, so I hope we can pass it next year.
Looking into the audience, I see, first I see, yes.
So, I'm actually one folks in Oregon, and a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, the Oregon Business Summit scared us all by talking about artificial intelligence and the change in what will happen with our labor force in the future. That, to me, strikes as something that you're going to need to address related to innovation. So, what are you going to do to help us?
I can jump.
Well, there's been a lot of conversation, just catching up on my radio and reading since we've been out of session. Presidential candidate Andrew Yang talks a lot about how, a lot of jobs are just getting lost because of technological changes. The hopeful upside of that is you're going to need individuals to maintain the new robots and the other things that are part of the manufacturing sector these days, those kind of automated services. Going back to the Student Success Act, we need to make sure that every student, no matter where they are, has access to those career and technical education programs, those advanced math classes, all those things that will prepare them to be the individuals of the next generation who actually take care of the equipment that will become more and more dominant in our manufacturing sector. So, we have to take the long view, but we have to plan now, and that's what we're trying to do here at the state.
I'll just add to that, that was a conversation we had at the Business Summit around the future of work. And to build off a little bit what both Speaker Kotek and Mark have said in previous answers, in that, things like artificial intelligence and the industries that surround that will eventually create more jobs for society. It's that transition and it's the investment in workforce and preparing. I think that addresses some of the concerns. So we have to keep that certainly at the forefront. Any other, President Nagy?
Great observation from the panel. Thank you. Speaker, I can't really give more microphone. I'm from Michael and the administrative personnel coming there. That challenge is a type of housing, not just housing. So those things become important. Likewise, the president likes both of our savings incentives yesterday. Those are great. So the question is to the economists, and I'm like others to it. You talk about
Yeah, and again, sometimes it's not necessarily bad if the innovation does get done by larger firms, and as long as it's still getting done, right? In terms of the volume of research and development, again, the more we look for things, the more we'll find the technologically enhancing productivity gains. But it is something that the state can certainly do to try to reduce the barriers that are facing startups and entry firms, in particularly a lot of the regulatory barriers that really give the big guys, the big successful firms, a leg up in terms of having the ability to deal with a lot of different paperwork and red tape and the like, which is what most of the startups cite and say that that's different today than it used to be. That we really can't handle getting through all this miles of red tape, and so we'll just sell out to the big guy. And the big profitable guy, again, is maybe not positioned to get the products to the market as well as the little guy, because the little guy, again, is just created there in knowing about a gap that's out there, and they're there to fill that gap. And the incentives from the big successful firm may be somewhat different.
I like the question and I like the answer. The thing I would add is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, we have a particularly unique role as an investor, and the active role that we can play in voting our shares and exerting our influence as limited partners in private markets. We're patient capital. We have a really nice opportunity and responsibility to think not just about the next quarter, but about many decades into the future and our ongoing obligations. And that allows us to say to the general partners we work with and to the companies where we invest, we want to see your long-term strategy. And if you had to sort of boil down our strategy into a couple of words, I think that might be it, that we're trying to defeat short-termism.
I think one of the things, agree with both of my colleagues here, I think the other thing we're trying to do at the state legislative level is to level the playing field among different types of companies, large and small. I do think the large employers, the larger corporations, often multi-state, many times multinationals, they just have more capacity to address the regulatory issue. When we passed the paid family medical leave insurance program this session, we wanted to make sure that smaller employers could be part of that program so they could be competitive with the Nikes, who can offer paid family medical leave to their employees. But if you're a 5-person startup, you can't make that happen. So when that insurance program goes online in a couple of years, employers under 25 employees will be able to participate in the program, but they will not have to pay into the program. And I think that was a good compromise to make sure all employees got covered at a certain size, but that the larger employers are paying in a way to make the whole program work for everybody. Now, employers of a smaller size can opt to get in voluntarily, and then there's a benefit and incentive to do that. But at the end of the day, every employee in the state will be covered, and so that competitive disadvantage that has been between the really large employers and the really small ones will go away. And so that is one way we want to continue to level the playing field, that employers can compete with the big guys who do have more infrastructure to deal with the regulatory issues.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I saw someone here on my left at least.
Hi, good afternoon. So Speaker Kotek, I applaud all of the efforts for the housing bills that were passed. Being at the Oregon Coastal Caucus and with a focus on Oregon coastal communities, the reality though is that a lot of those steps that were taken really benefit only larger cities and cities that are not on the Oregon coast, or more importantly, our rural unincorporated areas. Going back to livability and economic impacts, these areas are also severely hurting for housing, and we do have a serious housing shortage. In upcoming legislative sessions, do you know if there are going to be any efforts taken to focus on how to help rural coastal unincorporated areas and our smaller coastal cities on also having opportunities for addressing our housing crisis?
That's a really great question. Well, in total, the legislature this session committed $350 million in both bonded and general fund investments to work across the board on housing issues, from homeless prevention up to helping the construction of affordable housing. So that is a start. We did allocate about $5 million for the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department to work with rural communities to help get, there are issues about not even how people can build housing in some communities. I'm sure that's an issue on the coast, right? It's an issue everywhere in the state. Construction's at a maximum and everybody is trying to get things built. So trying to help local communities have companies who can build, help them, clear whatever hurdles are in the way to get more rural housing built. So there's some of that. I think we have to take a harder look at how we protect manufactured home parks, because manufactured home parks in rural communities, particularly on the coast, I'm sure, are a very important part of the affordable housing supply. So we need to protect them, improve them, and not just let them, get sold and redeveloped for something else. I think that in terms of the middle housing discussion with House Bill 2001, we can certainly continue to work with our local governments to help them make those changes. We required it for certain communities of certain sizes, but that doesn't necessarily prohibit communities from also doing it if they're not on the bill, but maybe they need some assistance to do that with their planning. We did pass a bill to help all communities live up to their land use goals around making sure they have the appropriate supply. We'll have better numbers a couple years from now about where we actually are. So this is really a decade in the making, and or more, and now it's going to take us a decade to build out of it. And I will tell you, and my colleagues understand, the housing supply problem is not just a urban or suburban issue. It is a very much a rural issue. And then the coast, as we all know, has limited spots where you can actually build. That's why I think encouraging more types of housing in the limited land that you have is really going to be important. So look forward to working with the Coastal Caucus on that. We can do more, and I'm definitely interested in doing more.
Thank you. I'm getting the signal that our time is up, so thank you, audience, for your questions.